I talked about split frequency. Well, I want to mention also one other technique that is very similar to split frequency, and it's usually referred to as inverted high pass. Now, I don't think that's the correct terminology, but that's how many people know it by, so I'll call it inverted high pass as well. If you open up inverted high pass or ihp.cr2 file, you can follow along with me. Now, in this image, this is an image of a dark skin model, and as you can see, her skin looks it's not in the greatest of shapes, and if we were to wanted to dodge and burn, we could, but maybe we can make a step before we dodge and burn, so we have less work to do. And we're going to try to do that with inverted high pass. So let me show you how it works. It's very similar, like I already mentioned, to split frequency, so I'm not going to be spending too much time explaining everything. I did that in the previous videos, so you will be able to follow along, I hope. So basically what we do is, again, we make 2 copies of our background layer, or the layer we're working on. So Command or Control J 2 times, and we're going to again call this one low. Oops, I double click accidentally, not on the name, but on this blue area. We're going to call this one low, and we're going to call this one high. Again, I'm going to deactivate the high, and I'm going to click on the low. Now, we can apply different, like before, we can apply different blurring filters to this. Now, typically, I'm going to show you how it works with Gaussian blur, but you can use others here. For instance, the main difference with Gaussian blur and, say, surface blur is that when you apply surface blur, you can paint, as we'll see, you can paint effect more closer to the edges. Downside is that it takes quite a bit of time for it to render. So for now, I'm going to use blur, Gaussian blur, and we're going to use some percentage. Let's try 30, for instance. At this point, I don't have all that skin texture. What I do have is shape of the image, right? I explained how that works in the previous video. Well, what we're looking for here, unlike before, we're looking for a number that's divisible by 3. So 30 we can divide by 3, that's 10, right? So I'm going to use 30 for this, and I'm going to click OK. Now I'm going to switch to my high, and I'm going to go to image again, apply image. And I'm going to select under my source for layer, I'm going to select my low. And again, I'm using it on an 8-bit image, so for me the settings will be subtract 2 and 128. I'm going to click OK. And here is a bit of a difference since before. Now we need to apply blur to this one more time with the same filter. But only this time we don't apply the 30 pixel blur, we apply 1/3 of that, and that's 10 in this case. So if we were to have some other number, we also need to use one that's divisible, easy divisible by 3. So I'm going to click OK to that. Next step in this recipe, if you will, is to invert this. So we're going to Control I or Command I on the layer, and that's going to invert the image. And then we switch to, like before, to linear light. At first it looks horrible. Now we need to deactivate our low layer. And now we get to see what we did here. If I deactivate it, activate it, you can see that it kind of blurred the image in a really weird way. Well, for this to really work, now I'm going to Alt or Option click on the mask. That's going to hide the effect by creating a black mask. I'm going to take my brush tool, and now I'm going to paint with white to reveal the effect only at certain areas of an image. For instance, here. On the cheeks as well, maybe on the nose a bit, and here on the forehead. Now you have to be very, very careful with this effect because it's so easy to go overboard, and it's so easy to turn everything flat looking and repeating pattern. So if you are going to use it with care, and use it along with dodging and burning. Try not to use it on its own unless you're in a really, really hurry and you're working some unimportant project. Now we have to be very careful that we don't paint somewhere near the edges, like here. If I were to paint here, I'm kind of blurring both edges, so be careful not to paint. near the edge. If I were to use, instead of Gaussian blur at the beginning, if I were to use something like a surface blur, then I would have more, I could paint closer to the edges without blurring them. So let's see how this looks. This is before and this is after. Before, after. You can kind of see what I did. I flattened out the image, but I also, especially on the cheek, let me zoom that in, right? Kind of even out those patches in a really, really quick way. So I don't think this should be done to replace dodge and burn, but if you're going to use it with dodge and burn and with care, it's going to produce probably the best results in the least amount of time. Now, we don't need the low anymore, so I'm going to delete that. And let's call this, for a moment here, let's call it 30 pixels. Because that's the radius we applied, so we kind of know what we did. And I'm going to deactivate that one for a moment, and I'm going to apply the next one by, again, Control J, double time to make 2 copies of the layer. Let's call this one low. Let's call this one high, and let's call it something like 48 maybe. And let's click on the low, and then this time instead of Gaussian blur, I'm going to apply blur, surface blur. And you can see what that does. It removed all those individual skin pores, but it also didn't blur the edges that much. And now the benefit of this is that when we apply surface blur, we can then paint the effect closer to the edges without blurring the edges as well. So let's use this maybe 48. And let's leave this, I don't know, so let's try 16. Yeah, that's going to give us really smooth look. Let's try these settings. And by the way, 48 divided by 3 is 16, but I don't think you need to worry about threshold here all that much. Although I'm going to use 16 just to make it a round number. I'm going to click OK. And as you can see, surface blur, unlike Gaussian blur, it's a more complicated filter algorithm, so it takes a bit of time for it to render the image. If you're working on a 16-bit, this might take a while, especially if you're working on a really large image. So let's give it a minute to render. It's almost done. Okay, now that we have it rendered, I'm going to click on the high once again. Go to Image, Apply Image. I'm going to click on the low, because that's the only low we have right now. Subtract and everything is just as we did before. Click OK. And now I'm going to apply blur, surface blur here once more time, except I'm going to divide this now by 3, so it's going to be 16. And let's put this to 0, for instance. And click, actually let's leave it at 2 because it cannot go lower than that, and click OK. And even though it's a smaller radius, it still takes time for it to render. And now Control Command I to invert it. Set it to linear light. Deactivate this one and see what we got. Well, we did manage to blur the image quite a bit. Question is, do we want to blur it on this level? We probably don't. But that's the beauty of selectively applying it. So I'm going to Alt-Option click on the mask to create a mask one more time. I'm going to deactivate the previous one. And now I'm going to paint just on certain areas. That's way too much. Here's an area that might benefit from this. So you can see, depending on different radiuses for different pores, you don't need to apply this to the entire image and then paint anywhere you want. But if you apply it on different areas of an image, it might give you the best results, probably. So don't satisfy yourself with just one radius. apply multiple radiuses and see how it looks. Now let's, by the way, because I did that, you can see now that I can paint quite close to the edge without affecting it. Now it doesn't matter if in this case it's way too smooth for my taste, but the thing that I mentioned about edges, that's something you don't get when using Gaussian blur so much. So let's zoom to maybe 50% and see what we got. I don't need this one anymore, the low, but I'm gonna Alt or Option click on the background, and you can see that in a relatively quick session we managed to smooth out this image without destroying the pores. Now with some dodge and burn to fix some of the other areas, and maybe even more passes with this on certain areas and certain size pores, but definitely with some dodging and burning in combination with this, we can relatively quickly get decent looking results. But if you really want to make it like a high-end image, I suggest that you do as much as possible with dodging and burning. And that's how inverted high pass works. Now you can use, I guess you can use different filters for it. You can use this technique for actually a little bit modified technique. You can use on hair, on different areas of an image, and clothing. It works really on everything, and it's quite big subject, and there are even different ways to apply the same effect with smart objects and so on, so you can make them editable. But that's a whole other topic, and it's quite long, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I just wanted to give you kind of an idea of what inverted high pass is, and give you some creative idea of how you might apply this into your own workflow.